Hello everyone, welcome to the next episode of the Circle Revival. Today with us, Professor Stefano Caria from the Oxford University. Before we start, I really want to briefly introduce to you to our audience. Professor Stefano Caria is a professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Oxford, uh, the academic director of CSAE, and a huge prize fellow at Jesus College. Huh. So, Professor, my first question, what made you choose labor and development economics?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me on
Mhm,
your interesting podcast. It's great to be here and to get a chance to talk to you. Um, so I was interested in development economics, and
mhm,
I mean, that was since the days of my undergrad. And after doing a master in economics at Oxford, actually, I joined a fellowship called the ODI Fellowship.
mhm,
It's quite popular in the UK. It's called the ODI stands for Overseas Development Institute, which is a think tank that does whatever think tanks do, but also runs these fellowships. It basically sends young graduate students to work for 2 years in a low
mhm,
or middle income country, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And I was assigned to Ethiopia. So I spent
mhm,
2 years in Ethiopia working not on labor markets, but rather on agriculture or
mhm,
shocks, mostly in rural areas. And during that time, I guess a couple of things happened. Um, One is that the Arab Spring happened, and
mhm,
Ethiopia wasn't directly involved in the Arab Spring. It's not an Arab country, but some of the same tensions could be seen in the country. So there was a
mhm,
increasingly large number of youth living in cities, growing dissatisfied with the government, and at the same time, Ethiopia was posting very healthy economic growth.
mhm,
So I started asking myself whether there was something about not just the lack of jobs, but something about the interactions of labor and firms in the cities that prevented these labor markets from clearing. And so um, at the end of the 2 year fellowship, although the particular job that I was doing in shock management was quite interesting, I felt that the academic questions that interest me the most were really at the intersection of labor and development, and hence I picked that as my topic for my PhD.
mhm. Got it, Professor. So, my following questions might not be related to your field, but I tried, as much as possible. But if they're not related, you may say, and we can skip the question. Why do some people stay on small family farms instead of moving to the city for higher paying work?
All right, so it's a big question, but I guess there are a number of answers. I mean, so the first thing to note is that there are big income gaps. So if you just were to compare the incomes of people in cities to the incomes of those that live in the countryside, you'll find big gaps. People in cities are so much better off. At the same time, it's unclear whether those gaps that you observe in the data are causal, in the
Mhm,
sense that it's unclear that that's the money that everybody would make if they were to move into cities. People may have different opportunities to make money in the city, and
mhm,
they may have some knowledge about their differential opportunities in the cities. And so the people that we see in the data moving to cities may be the people that are
mhm,
best placed to make the most of the city economy, to earn high wages in the cities. And so this is what economists would call selection. So it's unclear whether those gaps are reflecting a genuine causal effect of
mhm,
migrating from a small rural farm to a city, or whether some of that is actually just selection. And if the people that have stayed behind, they try to mimic the behavior of the people that they moved, maybe if this is a selection story, then they would not necessarily enjoy the same benefits.
mhm,
So obviously, this is a very hard question to settle. We have at least some experimental evidence suggesting that if you, at the margin, increase this kind of rural migration to cities in particular, there is a very nice paper now a few years old from Bangladesh that makes this point that they have some reasonable earnings that they can generate in the cities. So part of those gaps are causal, but there is also lots of papers that find evidence consistent with some significant selection. So the truth is probably in between. So partly is maybe this is not so surprising once we correct for selection those big gaps that we observe in the data. Second is although these are average gaps, from the point of view of the individual decision maker, you have to factor in uncertainty and in some cases sheer misinformation. So in some cases people may simply not know about average wages in the city, and even when they know that that's the average wage in the city, there is a distribution around that, so there is risk, and risk puts people off. So in fact there is a very recent experiment in Kenya showing that when you offer people insurance, should they not make the average wage that is offered in the city, that raises migration rates quite a bit. So I would say it's a little less of a puzzle once you consider that some of the observational gaps are due to selection, and after that there are issues related to being misinformed, being able to cope with the risk, and finally migration is unpleasant. So there is a big non-monetary cost to doing this, which puts people off.
Got it, Professor. And my next question, why might provoking free unemployment insurance actually encourage people to take riskier, high-paying jobs?
Yeah, so I mean that's it's so we don't have good evidence for that in low and middle income countries, but I think it's a very plausible hypothesis. In general, as I said before, I think there is good evidence that risk prevents investment in a number of domains. So it would be strange. And we do have evidence, for example, from my work in Ethiopia, that people do perceive a considerable risk of being laid off. So it's possible that this risk factors in the decisions of which jobs to accept or which jobs to target. And as a result, in a world where insurance against layoff shocks was more widely available, people will make different decisions. This is probably also true within the household. There is some work in progress work from Kevin Donovan at Yale and some of his co-authors that look at the role of shocks and how basically households insure each other by changing the labor supply when the other member of the household suffers from a shock. So it's possible that also um, some uh, um, some households would actually work less, and in fact, in many cases, that would skew the labor allocation towards the men. Should there be more insurance against labor market shocks? But in general, these shocks, in fact, perhaps they're a bit infrequent, but when they occur, they're very large because typically they're associated with a big economic downturn or a big shock in a sector or something like that. And so when they occur, they can be very painful. And as a result, the risk of those shocks it's likely distortionary, but we don't have experimental evidence precisely documenting this point. It's a plausible hypothesis.
Thank you, Professor. And my next question, why does sometimes the greater pay gap stay large even when women get more education?
The which gap? Sorry,
Uh, like pay gap, like
the
payment
pay
to.
gap. The pay gap. Yeah, yeah. I'm not. Um, the standard answer is this. I think in higher income countries,
Mhm,
um, prior to childbirth, prior to motherhood, prior to women having children, pay gaps have actually shrunk massively. So I think in some labor markets, prior to this one crucial event, we've got relatively close to maybe not we've not eradicated them completely, but I think they've shrunk really considerably. But where still you see, even in high income economies, big gaps emerging is after childbirth. So obviously there are biological reasons why childcare affects childbirth affects the woman more than the men. I mean, the woman has the baby in the first place, but there are a whole sort of then policy and
Mhm.
institutional and in fact cultural reasons
Mhm.
that then determine a lower attachment of the woman to the labor force after childbirth.
Mhm.
And so I guess the attention should really be in higher income economies should really
Mhm.
be on that process. In lower income economies, it's extremely heterogeneous, so it's hard to generalize. There are some countries, for example, in the Middle Eastern region or in South Asia, that have very low levels of labor force participation of women.
Mhm.
So there, the problem starts a lot earlier.
Mhm.
Um, and cultural norms are probably a key reason, although I have a recent paper in Egypt that also makes the point that perhaps um, even conditioning on cultural norms, there are mismatches
Mhm.
between the jobs that are available and the non-monetary amenities that women would like in order to
Mhm.
participate in the labor force. It's a chicken and egg problem. Perhaps some of this demand for non-monetary amenity deep down comes from norms that require women to take, a greater share of greater responsibility for household, for taking care of the household, for preparing food, for cleaning the house, and so on and so forth. But some of these may be not necessarily gendered. So, for example, in a big congested city, having a job nearby is just a non-monetary amenity that people value. Um, so not all of this is necessarily down to norms and an unequal division
Mhm.
of household chores. Um, then you have so that's in countries like in the Middle Eastern region or in South Asia. And in fact, in South Asia, we have a couple of experiments by Lisa Ho at MIT that offer fairly promising results, showing that when you can offer some of the amenities that women would like to have, you
Mhm.
do get increases in labor force participation among women.
Mhm.
Then you have lots of other low-income countries where female labor force participation is actually relatively high. So sub-Saharan
Mhm.
Africa, many countries actually have much smaller gaps, at least in employment. Um, and there, I guess, there would be different constraints.
Mhm. Oh, got it. Uh, my last question for part one. How does first generation college status affect lifetime earning?
Yeah, Abdulaziz, thank you for this question. I mean, it's the answer is we don't know, and we should know. And the answer, part of the reason why we don't know is that this is something that has been studied very extensively in
Mhm.
places like the US or Europe, where we know that there is this big persistence, big people call it the intergenerational transmission of intergenerational mobility. So, for example,
Mhm.
your place in the income distribution is highly correlated with the place in the income distribution of your parents. And
Mhm.
there used to be a time when the US, for example, had high levels of mobility, where people ultimate position in the income distribution wasn't very much determined by where the parents came from in the income distribution, but that has is no longer the case. And
Mhm.
so we know from European and North American countries that in those places mobility is a big thing. That there is lack of mobility.
Mhm.
Um, for middle and lower income countries, the evidence is a lot thinner. Partly is
Mhm.
because to do these mobility studies, you need very good data both on the parents and on the children, and those data sets are hard to get. For example, some of the best work uses really high quality, granular, and extensive universal administrative data that lets you link fathers and children, and that data is typically not available, say, in sub-Saharan Africa or so on. But there are studies. The World Bank has been leading on a couple of these that rather than correlating actual income, they correlate predicted income.
Mhm.
Now, it's a lot noisier, but keeping this methodology fixed, you do find even greater lack of mobility in
Mhm.
lower income countries. So it's an imperfect measure, but if according to this imperfect measure, the problem is even worse.
Mhm.
For example, in a place like Kenya or Tanzania, and so why exactly that happens hasn't been studied, but I think it's in lower income countries. But I think it's a huge area of interest. It's possible the social capital is part of the explanation, although governments have made big investments in making human capital more freely available. It still makes a huge difference whether your parents instill in you a certain cultural sense of cultural norms, expectation, behaviors, codes in language, and so on and so forth, that then make you more employable or make it easier for you to convince employers of your employability. So social capital is part of this. And of course, despite the fact that governments have invested in, for example, free primary education heavily, there are still investments that need to be made from the families themselves in order to help bright children, for example, achieve university and graduate and so on. And obviously, families' ability to make those monetary and time investments in human capital, in the human capital of the children, it's very heterogeneous. Poorer families will just be less able to make those investments. And as a result, on top of an equal social capital, which is very hard to for policy to undo, even in terms of human capital, it's likely that investment from the governments have just not gone far enough to really level the playing field and give the poor, the sons and daughters of the poor, the same chances as the sons and the daughters of the rich to achieve full, university education, for example.
Got it. Thank you, Professor. Moving on, I had some questions to your research paper that is called Matching Frictions and Distorted Beliefs, Evidence from a Job Fair Experiment. So my first one is about like the surprising result. So why did a job fair with almost zero instant hires end up doubling long-term jobs for non-college workers later on?
Yeah, yeah. So one thing that we are increasingly realizing about labor markets, certainly in low and middle income countries, which is where my research is based, but there is similar evidence also for high income countries, is that people enter these markets with fairly inaccurate beliefs about the fundamentals of these markets. So you know, it's not as if you, for example, let's take the market for houses in a country like the UK. Now, if you want to buy a house in the UK or rent a house in the UK, there are these websites, and you can go and you can see the current supply. Like everything is that's public information. You can click at a few links and see what a house of that size would cost in rent or in price if you want to buy it. And in fact, that's the prices that people are asking. You may think maybe sometimes people contract the price down, but there is official data that is also available for you to check on the actual prices that things were sold for. So information is very transparent. And yes, those markets are not perfect as well, but things are very transparent. But in labor markets, you don't have similar mechanisms where you can see exactly what workers with a given set of qualifications are making, or for employers, exactly what's the ability differential between people that graduated in college A, average ability differential between what people who graduated in college A have compared to people who graduated in college B that is less prestigious, for example. And so people form beliefs about these things, and these beliefs will influence their decisions, how hard to search for job seekers or for employers, what qualifications to request. But these beliefs can be fairly wrong, fairly inaccurate. And so what we find in the paper was that we organized these large job fairs between a sample of mostly unemployed youth and some firms that were a representative sample of firms selected in key sectors in the city, and we brought them together. They came with fairly mismatched expectations. In particular, the job seekers were expecting really high wages that firms were not prepared to offer to entry-level workers with limited experience. So there were very few jobs that were generated immediately as a direct consequence of the fair. But by interacting with one another, I think the job seekers learned and became a bit more realistic about the distribution of opportunities in that labor market. And the firms too, they learned. In fact, they realized that perhaps some of the credentials that they were using, they were overinflated. So both of them revised their search strategies with some evidence of gains for at least some subgroups in the experiment.
Got it. And my next question: why do job hunters and companies stay so wrong about salaries and hiring chances even after months of real-world experience?
Abdullah, you just say it once more. Why do job hunters do what?
Why do job hunters and companies stay so wrong about salaries and hiring
Oh, stay so
chances?
wrong.
Uh-huh.
Stay so wrong. Sorry, sorry. That's the word I missed. And by the way, please don't call me professor. So, professor, please call me Stefano. It's
Uh-huh.
Stefano is good. So yes, so part of the challenge. There are two problems here. One is um, these are not huge firms. Although our sample excluded the smallest of firms, still average firm size, to be honest, I forgot, but it would be something like 40 workers, something like that, 30 workers. So let's take that as a benchmark. These firms hire quite a lot, but still, if you have a hiring rate of, say, 20% in a 30 worker firm, it means that you only hire 6 job seekers per year across different occupations, different job titles, and so on. So the actual amount of information that you get as a HR professional or as a firm owner and so on these fundamentals is limited. So that's the first problem. It would be different if you're a huge company that gets thousands of applicants, multiple positions. So then you actually get quite good at learning. But for these medium-sized companies that are really, the majority of there are very few companies that grow to a size larger than that in certainly low-income countries. For those companies, you just don't get the amount of information that would be required to properly learn. So that's first reason. Information is scarce. Second reason is there is a self-fulfilling quality to some of these prophecies, these beliefs. So, for example, if you or there is lack of self-correction in the sense that suppose that you, for example, think that a certain credential is needed for this job, then you set that as a requirement, then you never see what people who don't have that credential could do. They never come for an interview because you exclude them from the pool of applicants from the start. And so you never get the information to correct those beliefs. So information is scarce, but also um, um, because it then changes your search strategy. Sometimes there is no self-correction mechanism for your own beliefs. On the job seeker side, there is an additional mechanism which is, I think, quite psychological, and that is, I suspect, um, um, the people who disclose, for example, the salaries that they make are both selected in the sense that these are typically the people that got a good role and they have something to brag about rather than who are not very happy with what they're getting. And uh, even if they were not selected, in any case, probably that information is more salient in your mind. So I think on top of it, we typically find that job seekers do overestimate salaries quite a bit, and that's or become overconfident. And there may be a number of reasons, but one of these reasons may be that information that is passed through social networks is both selected and there is this differential salience of the you'd be most likely to remember the stories of the people that did particularly well.
Uh-huh. Uh, my next question: why did companies assume college grads were 4 times smarter or more skilled than high school grads when they actually weren't?
Yeah, I mean, in Ethiopia, I suspect also there may be so this paper is based in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, there may be one specific feature of the economy, which is common in other countries, which is found in other countries too, and that is tertiary education. So the university system has expanded tremendously in recent years. In the past, it was fairly selective thing. So the cutoff to make it into university was very high. So only the best of the best students would get a spot. But as you expand places, it just becomes a little less selective. So yeah, and potentially also you water down quality. That's also a concern. So it may be that employers they themselves studied in under the previous system, and so in their view, a university degree just conferred that extra mark of quality, and it was really a high quality thing. And standards had weakened and selection had weakened. So um, that wasn't reflecting the realities in the market at that particular moment.
Mm-hmm. And my last question for your research paper, giving job hunters a harsh reality check made them try harder in Ethiopia. So why did it make people in other countries give up completely?
Oh, yes, that's a fantastic question. And so I don't know. I can speculate.
Mm-hmm.
But there is one slight um, perhaps qualification that I should make, and that is not that statement is true for job seekers, not really for job hunters. So
Mm-hmm.
there are other studies that have treatments that, in a sense, do something similar to our job fair, but they're not job fairs. There is one extra job, another couple of job fairs paper, but some of these other studies have this similar quality that they basically help job seekers learn about the labor market. For example, there is a study in South Africa that takes job seekers to they live in the periphery of town, the outskirts of town, and he funds their bus fares or to travel to the center of town. Or there are other studies that match job seekers with some firms. So there are these studies that basically generate some learning. And in the studies, what you find is beliefs become more pessimistic, just like in ours. But in our study, belief more pessimistic was associated with, then led to more investment in job search, whereas
Mm-hmm.
in those studies that you're citing, it made people invest less in
Mm-hmm.
job search. So now the question is, why did it go? Uh, uh, why was the response in the opposite direction in those studies compared to ours? And I guess so. So we have a model in the paper that tries to make the point that basically this really depends on how um, on how on how desperate you are, or on how that's not the right on how valuable it is to you to get a job right away. So just theoretically, once if you are not in a huge rush and you learn that getting something valuable it's a bit harder, often the model would say then you should just spend less, you should invest less in searching for this, because the probability that you'll never get it, it's just gone up. But if you're really determined to get this objective, then learning that it's even harder than you thought pushes you to work harder.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really down to your preferences. The beliefs they have changed in the same way, but depending on how determined you are to ensure that the outcome takes place soon, it will generate a different behavioral response. So Ethiopia is a poorer country, certainly than South Africa, and it is poorer than Kenya, in Uganda, where one of these other studies was set in. Perhaps not a lot poorer, but I suspect the people in the Uganda study were slightly better off than the people in our Ethiopia study, because they were people who had fairly good technical qualifications. So
Uh-huh.
whereas we had a representative sample that included a lot of people that were a lot less skilled than that sample,
Uh-huh.
and so perhaps is about where in the income distribution these people sit. So our sample was a lot poorer than those in these comparator studies.
Got it. And moving on, I had some questions also about your research paper that is called Mitigating the Consequences of Job Loss in Lower Income Countries, Evidence from Ethiopia. So my first question, why is getting all severance pay it at once worse for holding a job than monthly payments?
Yeah, so perhaps let me just make a couple of preliminary remarks and then I'll answer your question. So, um, as we said at the beginning, job loss is a very common shock. It occurs in all labor markets. Even formal jobs tend to be destroyed. I mean, it's not something that happens, regularly every month, but most or a lot of workers will be exposed to job loss at some point, involuntary job loss. I mean, at some point during their life. Now, in high-income countries, this is a
Mm-hmm.
central fact that is the people have in mind when they formulate labor market policy. And so a lot of what labor market policy is about ensuring that there is sufficient insurance against these shocks.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, that insurance has two components: a lump sum that you get paid for by the employer at the time of the layoff shock, and then monthly support that is given to you afterwards by the government. You paid for it through your social security contribution, but then, the moment that there is a shock, the government gets money out of that pool of resources that all the workers were paying into and pays out your unemployment insurance. That's a monthly transfer, and it's typically also conditioned on only available if you remain unemployed, and
Mm-hmm.
typically only for up to a year or so. But so it provides a cushion for those first few months when you need resources to look for a job. Now, as you go down, then this is in high income economies. If you go down the income distribution, the lump sum component, which is called severance pay, that's still very common at all levels of the income distribution. So most countries have some form of severance pay. But the monthly and conditional component unemployment insurance becomes rarer and rarer to the point that, so I don't know about Uzbekistan, but if you were to go in low income countries, then it becomes, there are very, very, very few low income countries that have unemployment insurance. It's basically not available. So the amount of resources that people get in these countries ends up being a lot lower because the replacement rate, the relative generosity of the severance pay changes a little bit across levels of development, but it's kind of similar. And so there is the second component of protection that people just miss. So that's the context. Now, in our study in Ethiopia, we basically topped up the existing severance pay, which was the only thing available to these workers in a manufacturing context. So these were female workers that had lost a job that they had in a big garment factory due to a tariff shock, and they would only get the severance pay. And so we try to top that up, either by paying them a monthly top up or, in this case, unconditional. So it was for 5 months, but it wouldn't depend on whether they would get another job or not. Or they would get this lump sum, this severance pay type payment just in one go at the beginning of the unemployment spell. And what we found, surprisingly, um, was that actually there were big differences between how people responded to these two transfers. The monthly transfer worked fairly well, if I can say so, just in terms of how at least the policymaker would want a scheme like that to work. So people it supported the consumption over the course of the following year. In fact, we can estimate that it reduced the consumption expenditure loss that was generated by this shock by about one third. And it was a big shock for these workers. So poverty rates doubled, consumption expenditure dropped by about, depending on the measure you use, 10-15% over the course of the year, which for a sample of workers near poverty, these are big, big losses. And so we can close about one third of the gap through this transfer. On the other hand, if you gave people lump sum, what happened instead was that they spent a lot right at the beginning. Then they started getting reemployed at lower rates, so their income dropped, and as a result, their consumption dropped back to the level of the control group because all of a sudden they had less income than people in the control group. Sure, they had gotten all the transfer at the start, but their monthly income had dropped. And these differences in employment rate persist for over 13 months, so that we see this big employment gap of 10 percentage points 13 months after the shock, if you give people lump sum, and also a big gap in migration. Lots of people have just gone back to the rural original places and left the city and the surrounding area to the manufacturing company where they used to work. So it's a big, there is a big difference in how people respond to those two treatments. Why is that the case? Well, it seems that there are two types here, really, two different types of workers. And we have evidence of this because we asked at the beginning of the study um, to people which type of transfer they would like. And this is highly predictive of how people end up responding. Some people want the monthly transfer, and when we ask them why, they mostly say, well, I want to control my expenditure. So for them, the main goal is I want a stable stream of income that can support me while I'm looking for another job. And when they get it, that's what happens. They support themselves for this period. They don't stop working and so on. These people, on the other hand, if you give them the lump sum, they're the people driving the drop in employment because they spend a lot and then change their sorry, they're not the people driving the drop in employment. They're the people driving the early expenditure spike. So they wanted to control their expenditure. They failed to do so if they have all the money in one go. Then there is another group, a second group that acts more in a time consistent way, more rationally if you want. And what they're doing is basically they get they probably want to make some big investment. Potentially, they just want to fund migration back home, or they want to fund the creation of a business. But those who try to start a business typically fail, and that second group then ends up working less. So why does it lead to different consumption responses? Well, it's because there is a group that needs a device to control its expenditure. And if you don't give it to them, they overspend. Why does it lead to different employment responses? Well, because there is a second group that would like to fund a discrete investment that takes them out of wage employment.
And my next question, why did factory workers in Ethiopia suffer much worse job losses than workers in richer countries?
Um, so, so in our study, we have a quasi-experimental estimate of the employment cost of this shock 13 months after the shock. So basically, we match workers in who suffered this layoff shock to workers in a nearby factory that wasn't affected by the tariff change and so didn't lay off workers en masse. We can find that 30 months afterwards, although lots of the displaced workers do find employment, many of them remain unemployed, and so there is still a huge gap, about 30 percentage points. If you compare that with some of the data that exists for example, there is a beautiful paper by Rose in the US. So if you compare those estimates to their estimates for low-wage workers in the US, they also have persistent employment losses if they're laid off. So it's not as if the employment rate of those that were laid off goes back to 100% or to the rate of the comparison group, but they have lower magnitude. I think one thing that was striking in our setting is that despite the fact that we are in a big city, well, not a big city, but medium-sized city of 400,000 people, the manufacturing workers in our study, they then searched exclusively, not exclusively, sorry, but still, they searched mostly for other manufacturing jobs. And so that was not a declining sector because employment in the sector, except for this big layoff shock, remained fairly constant, but still a relatively limited sector. And I suspect that in the US context, those workers were a bit more mobile across sectors. So after layoff shock, if you don't want to change sector, obviously, and you're searching very narrowly, that will limit your chances of securing another job.
And my next question, why can relying on family for financial help feel like a double-edged sword?
So this is a point that has been made by other people in the past. obviously families do play a role, and in our study they played a massive role. So the people that were laid off, they received big transfers from the family over the course of the year, and they were still receiving them 13 months after the shock. So they became very dependent financially from their households. They didn't seem too happy about it. Some of them said that there was an expectation that they would give the money back. Some of them, um, not we thought we were worried about also loss of autonomy, that the families then would um, because everybody in that sample is a woman. We thought maybe, the family will take more control of their marriage or partner decisions. That we don't have a lot of evidence for, but still, when asked, they would have rather avoided having to rely on the
Mm-hmm.
families. So there are probably different forms of social pressure and psychological costs that come with that. And also, I mean, children probably know the sacrifices that families are going through in order to support them. So that alone is a reason to add a cost. So yes, it works, but it's an imperfect substitute to formal insurance.
Thank you. And my next question: should workers get to pick how their employment money is paid?
Yeah, by and large, we think so. It's depends a little bit what you want to maximize as a policymaker, what your objective is. But if your objective is worker welfare, then choice typically is a good idea. And in our case, we documented there are different preferences, very different views as to what the favorite payment modality is. So so choice would make the program a lot more appealing because people could tailor the program to their specific circumstances, to their specific plans.
Mm-hmm.
One of these choices, lots of people who would make the choice of getting the money lump sum, which, as we've seen, actually then end up discouraging wage employment. And so, if the government has the objective of promoting wage employment, which they often do, certainly in this case they do, then giving choice is has this negative implication.
Mm-hmm.
But that some people will choose something that then pushes them away from the labor market. But if your objective is just worker welfare, then choice is optimal.
Mm-hmm. But I wonder, like, what's the benefit of getting serious payment? Because, like, for example, getting high amounts of money, in particular, uh, I mean, day of the year, I mean, entire year, getting once payment, like, yeah, but very high compared to, I mean, higher than, like one monthly payment. But, like, I guess there is also some. I don't really think that people kind of can control themselves when they kind of get such a huge amount of money. So, like, kind of giving it, like every month, like, separating it into months, I guess, kind of better. But still, like, I kind of wonder, like, what's the benefit of, like, I mean, what people are thinking about when they are choosing to get severance payment.
They're probably thinking, I'd like to spend it all on something big. I'd like to buy,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, a motorbike, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe not for this simple motorbike, but for example, if you wanted to start a business, maybe you buy some produce to sell, some
Mm-hmm.
if you want to, or maybe you buy, you know, a ticket back home, and you have a pot of money that you can use because you know that at home for a while you will not be working. So you invest in taking time off and spending time with your family. You could do all sorts of things that are bulky. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what they have in mind. And by the way, I mean, the people, so another thing was that the people that were offered the lump sum and got the lump, sorry, the people that wanted the lump sum and got it, they were not less likely to demand the lump sum when we asked them, okay, should we offer this program in the future, or which type of payment would you like? They did not become um, less enthusiastic about the lump sum. They still wanted the lump sum in
Uh-huh.
decent numbers. So that group was fairly rational. They didn't have huge disappointment with themselves with how they spent that money. They kind of spent it the way they wanted to spend it, I think.
Mhm.
Not everybody, but that group that had the demand for it.
Mhm.
And Abdulaziz, I will have to go in a minute, unfortunately, because I have another
No, no, no.
call.
Like, those were my all questions. Thank you, Professor. I really do appreciate your time, and yeah, I really do appreciate your time, your answers to the question. And sorry, Mr. Stefano. Like, sorry for calling you
Yeah,
again.
don't worry,
So,
don't worry.
so good luck on your future research papers. So thank you for being our guest today.
My pleasure, my pleasure. And it's exciting to be part of your inspirational
Mhm.
initiative. Good luck with that. It's a very nice idea.
Mhm. Bye.